Most game studios spend years refining the same formula. Rockstar built GTA, From Software perfected Souls games, Insomniac became synonymous with Spider-Man, Warhorse mastered the medieval setting of Kingdom Come Deliverance, but Remedy almost seems to do the exact opposite. Every time they create something successful, they immediately start changing it. Somehow it has worked for over 20 years, and after looking through Control Resonant, Alan Wake 2, Control, and even Max Payne, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's the studio's entire philosophy. If you look at the games industry, most successful studios eventually find a formula. Once they discover what players love, they refine it. They make it bigger, they polish it, and over time, that formula becomes their identity. You can usually tell what kind of game you're getting before you even see the trailer. Rockstar has GTA, From Software has Souls, Naughty Dog has cinematic adventures, Insomniac has Spider-Man, but Remedy has never really worked that way. Looking back over the last 2 decades, it's surprisingly difficult to find two Remedy games that play alike. Max Payne reinvented third-person shooters with bullet time. Alan Wake shifted towards psychological horror. Control mixed supernatural storytelling with telekinetic combat and surreal world design. And now Control Resonant appears to be doing it again. Instead of simply making a bigger version of Control, Remedy has changed the protagonist, redesigned the combat, expanded the RPG systems, and completely altered how players approach the world. At first, that seems unusual, but the more I looked into Remedy's history, the more I realized this isn't unusual at all. It's exactly what they've always done. While I looked through Remedy's history, the more one thing stood out. Most successful studios spend years refining a formula once they've found it. They build on what already worked, they make it bigger, they make it more polished, more ambitious, but rarely completely different from each other. Remedy almost seems to think the exact opposite. Every time they create something successful, they immediately start asking a different question. Not how do we make more of this, but where do we go next? Take Max Payne, for example. It wasn't just another third-person shooter. Bullet time completely changed how players experienced gunfights and quickly became one of the most recognizable mechanics of its generation. For most studios, that would have become their identity. Bigger levels, more weapons, better graphics, the same foundation. Instead, Remedy eventually walked away from the franchise entirely. Most studios would have spent years building on that success. Remedy chose to leave it behind. And then came Alan Wake. Rather than building another stylish action shooter, Remedy shifted towards psychological horror, blending television-inspired storytelling, live action, and surreal mystery into something that felt completely different. And just when players began associating Remedy with Alan Wake, the studio changed direction yet again. Control abandoned forest for brutalist architecture, flashlights became telekinesis, small-town horror became bureaucratic cosmic horror, and even though both games shared Remedy's signature style of storytelling, they couldn't have felt more different to actually play. And now they're doing it again. Most studios would have looked at Control and asked, how do we make a bigger Control? Remedy seems to have asked something else entirely. What if Control played differently? Control Resonant doesn't simply expand the original game, it changes the protagonist, it redesigns the combat around melee encounters, it expands player builds and progression, and it fundamentally changes how players interact with the world. At some point you stop looking at these as isolated, creative decisions. You start seeing a pattern. Remedy doesn't seem interested in refining a successful formula. It instead seems like they're more interested in reinventing it. So why does Remedy keep doing this? Why walk away from formulas that already work? Most studios wouldn't dream about doing something like that. When players love a game, the safest decision is usually obvious. Give them more. A bigger world, more weapons, more abilities, more of what made the first game successful. There's nothing wrong with that. Some of the greatest sequels ever made followed exactly that philosophy, but Remedy doesn't seem particularly interested in making the safest sequel possible. And perhaps the clearest evidence of that comes from Remedy themselves. Speaking about Control Resonant, creative director Michael Kasurian described it as, "This is not a safe sequel." That's a fascinating way to describe the follow-up to one of the most successful games, because it tells us that playing it safe was never the objective. Instead, they seem to approach every new project from a different angle, not by asking how to build directly on what came before, but by stepping back and reconsidering what kind of experiences they want to create next. It's a subtle shift in perspective, but it changes everything, because when your goal isn't simply refinement, you're far more likely to take risks. You change protagonists, you redesign combat, you shift genres, you build entirely new worlds instead of revisiting old ones. You don't just iterate, you reinvent. That approach is exciting, but it's also dangerous. Every time Remedy releases a new game, they give players something unfamiliar, something that leads to incredible moments. Other times it means players need time to understand what the studio is actually trying to do. And I think that's exactly where Control Resonant finds itself today. A lot of discussion focuses on what's changing, the new combat, the new protagonist, the new progression systems, but maybe that's the wrong question. Because if Remedy's history tells us anything, it's that change isn't a departure from the studio's identity, it is the studio's identity. And that's why I think so many people are looking at Control Resonant the wrong way. I've seen a lot of discussions comparing it directly to Control. Stuff like, why isn't Jesse the protagonist? Why is the combat so different? Why shift toward melee combat? And why change something that's already worked? Those are all fair questions to ask, but they only make sense if you assume Remedy's goal was to make more Control. Looking at the studio's history, I don't think it ever was, because this isn't the first time Remedy has challenged the expectations created by one of its own games. It's simply the latest example. Control Resonant doesn't look like a studio abandoning what made Control special. It looks like a studio asking what else that universe is capable of becoming. And that's a very different mindset. Instead of creating Control as a finished formula to refine, Remedy seems to treat it as a creative foundation to build from. That interpretation is reinforced by something Remedy has said repeatedly over the years. They want each of their games to stand on its own feet. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with Control Resonant. Rather than relying on Control's success, Remedy seems determined to make Resonant justify its own existence. A universe that can support different characters and different mechanics, such as choosing Dylan instead of Jesse. That isn't just another protagonist swap, it's another example of Remedy looking for a different perspective rather than repeating the previous one. And when you look at it through that lens, many of the changes suddenly stops feeling surprising. They start feeling inevitable, because if Remedy had simply released Control but bigger, it might have been exactly the kind of sequel most players expected, but it also would have been the kind of sequel Remedy almost never makes. Whether every change works remains to be seen. The game is still months away, and we've only seen a small slice of what the studio is building, but if history tells us anything, it's that judging a Remedy game solely by how closely it resembles its predecessor has never been the best way to understand what the studio is trying to create. So, does Control Resonant actually prove that Remedy doesn't make normal sequels? I think it does. Not because every creative decision will necessarily work, and not because every change will automatically make the game better. We'll only know that once the game is in our hands. What I think it proves is something much more interesting. For most studios, success becomes a formula, something to protect and something to refine. For Remedy, success seems to become a question. What else could this become? That's a much riskier way of making games. Sometimes it means players need time to understand what the studio is trying to do. Sometimes it means taking creative risks that don't always pay off, but it also means every new project feels genuinely different from the last. And in an industry where so many sequels are built around making everything bigger, Remedy continues asking a very different question. How do we make it different? Whether Control Resonant ultimately succeeds or fails almost feels secondary, because I think the game has already revealed something interesting about Remedy. They're not trying to perfect a formula, they're trying to avoid being defined by one. And maybe that's not just my interpretation. Remedy has said that one of the questions they constantly ask themselves is, how can we be innovators and not followers of trends? And looking at their history, I think they've been answering that question for more than 20 years. And maybe that's exactly why their games continue to feel so unlike anything else.